The crises of the 1940s, 50s, 60s that spurred the civil rights movement, they didn't go away after the passage of civil rights legislation and the passage of fair housing. The long history of the system, which includes banks and government officials and real estate agents and large developers organizing against African Americans, not allowing them to move into certain neighborhoods, charging them higher rents, persisted into the 1970s and beyond. According to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, in 1971, City Commissioner on Human Rights Chairman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who later became a congresswoman, she investigated real estate agencies and found, quote, ample circumstantial evidence to indicate that realtors are deliberately fomenting fear and racial bigotry. And this was playing out all over the five boroughs. In Queens, there was a company called the Trump Management Corporation, connected to our past president, President Trump, owner of about 15,000 apartments. Because of the efforts of organizers in the tenant organizing movement and within the Black community, so the Department of Justice sued the Trump organization for their refusal to rent their apartments to African Americans in the city, which was a violation of the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. But what the Trump organization did by disallowing Black residents into their apartment buildings, and what Holmes Norton is unveiling with her report, this stirred the pot of racial animosity against Black New Yorkers by the rest of the city by keeping them separate and in accommodations that don't lend themselves to thriving. This allowed stereotypes to perpetuate, which would have dramatic impacts on Black New Yorkers over the course of the next 5 decades. On top of this discrimination, in the 1970s, you also have the city, which is marred in a financial crisis. The city was on the brink of bankruptcy, and a lot of this had to do with the fact that money was going to war. The United States was fighting a war in Vietnam, and a lot of that money had been going to cities. And so money is getting taken out of cities. There's divestment, money taken out of cities, that is used to go and fight overseas. And so what do you do when you're in a financial situation? They embrace something called austerity, which means they were cutting back social programs. And so that means they're cutting funding to schools and public housing and transportation. And so what does it do when you cut social services for poor folks? Does that make them lift themselves up, or does that make them poorer? What we saw in New York in the 1970s is it made them poor, and it made these communities in which Black and brown folks lived a lot tougher. This meant that communities began falling apart, right? And while communities are falling apart, if you have the means to get out, you do. And so on top of white flight, which we talked about last episode, which continued happening during this period, you see a lot of middle-class African Americans leaving neighborhoods like Harlem, neighborhoods like Bedford-Stuyvesant, leaving neighborhoods within the Bronx that used to be their home. The historically Black communities like Harlem, they continue to lose populations because African Americans that can get out and go places that are in better shape did so. Harlem lost 60% of its residents between 1950 and 1980 due to these trends. So with all these people leaving the city, with the folks staying not having much money, a lot of landlords found themselves owning properties that were less valuable than they had been previously. So these people are looking around, these landlords, and they're saying, well, I'm not making as much money renting out apartments like I had been. And so what do? What a lot of them chose to do is burn down the buildings that they own to recoup the insurance money. And this was particularly true in the neighborhood of the South Bronx, which was overwhelmingly Black and Latino at this point. 1/5 of the buildings in the South Bronx were vacated because of the austerity programs, where there is divestment from the city. There was not good funding for the fire department. So a lot of times these fires would start and there was nobody there to put them out. And this wasn't an accident. I mean, there was a plan called Planned Shrinkage, which was designed to clear out neighborhoods like the South Bronx so that later on developers could come in and purchase land and property for very cheap and redevelop it and market it to wealthier folks. After President Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, the situation got even worse on a federal level for low-income communities. 500,000 people were removed from welfare. Another million were taken off food stamps, and 2.6 million were kicked off of free lunch programs. And so these neighborhoods become symbols of urban decline, right? You have reduced social services. You have buildings that are boarded up, homes that are no longer tenable to live in. And when you have a situation like this, it leads to people trying to do criminal activity to make a buck. And so there is an increase in crime during this period. 1960, for instance, before this all started going down, there was about 1,700 robberies in the South Bronx and the Lower East Side. 1969, there's 29,000. Again, remember, these communities had tried to organize in the form of organizing with Malcolm X, organizing with the Black Panthers. And every time they try to organize to create community structures, they were mowed down by police, either thrown in jail or literally killed. And so this is sort of the result of all of that. 1977 lightning strike, which took out electricity in the city for 24 hours. This was seen as an opportunity by a lot of people in these communities to recoup some of the things that they had lost over the past 2 decades. And so you see widespread looting. And this confirms for a lot of white New Yorkers the negative stereotypes that they had been developing about Black New Yorkers, right? They're not looking at the city cutting social services and landlords burning down buildings as being responsible for the state of these Black and brown communities and the redlining and all the other forms of discrimination we've talked about up to this point. They're just looking at the result, right? And I mean, when these people have nothing or very little, that whole group gets kind of stereotyped as criminal. But African Americans in these communities, it's not like they were just tolerating this and accepting it. There were different forms of resistance, including the invention of new art forms to let the wider world know about the conditions that they were living through and to push for change, both on a policy level and in terms of individual transformations. Art became a form of expressing the conditions that were overwhelming the community and giving a voice to the voiceless. And perhaps the most famous to come out of the early era of hip hop after its foundation in the Bronx in the late 1970s was Grandmaster Flash. Listen to him here.
Broken glass everywhere, people on the stage, you know they just don't care. I can't take the smell, can't take the noise. Got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with a tow truck repossessed my car. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
As the Bronx was burning from landlords setting their apartment buildings on fire, this new form of expression emerged, which has resulted in one of the most dominant forms of music in the 21st century. To understand the crack wars that began in the mid-1980s in New York and elsewhere, it's important to sort of understand the genesis of the drug. Cocaine was, which is very similar to crack in a lot of ways, and crack is actually made out of cocaine, was considered a very cool drug. It was expensive, it was high society. Lots of wealthy people would be using cocaine at parties, and it was considered a whiter drug. The inner cities, poor Black and brown communities, they could not afford cocaine. It was just far too expensive. However, in the early to mid 80s, there was a new way of processing cocaine where you would cook it, and that were crack, and people would melt that down and smoke it. And it was cut with like baking soda, so you would have a lot more of it for cheaper. The price of cocaine had been dropping anyway, and so all of a sudden, this new drug becomes widely available in these low-income neighborhoods. Poor folks were able to get high for $5 to $10 when previously that would be upwards of $50. But initially, the majority of users, and actually throughout the crack epidemic, the majority of users were white. But the way this was covered by the media, it was seen as an inner city problem. It was seen as a Black problem. The conditions that allowed crack to kind of take hold are what we're already talking about, right? We have these communities where there isn't so much hope or opportunity for social mobility, And there's great inequity. There's high unemployment, and it was way higher for Black Americans. The minimum wage was extremely low. And so a lot of folks are looking around and being like, I could go work at McDonald's for a little over $3 an hour. And that was the minimum wage in the 1980s. Or I could sell drugs. Now, it's important to note the vast majority of people in Black and brown communities during this period, during the mid 80s into the 1990s, were not using crack, were not selling crack. This was a small percentage of the population. However, the epidemic was quite devastating to these communities because of the war on crack by federal authorities, the violence that erupted between rival crack dealers and levels of addiction were extremely high. Again, I want to emphasize that the majority of crack users were white. However, unlike other drugs, much of the business infrastructure was controlled by African Americans. And so this gets framed as a Black issue, an inner city issue. So what does the US government do? I mean, they have this real issue that's clearly a medical issue. Folks are becoming addicted to this new drug. It is destroying communities. They could put money into rehabilitation. They could put money into helping out these communities, lifting them up, giving them other options to make money for social mobility other than selling drugs, or they could crack down. And that's what they chose to do. They cracked down in very high ways. This is not to say that the war on drugs began with the crack epidemic. It actually began much earlier in the early 1970s under the Nixon administration, and then was expanded in New York with the passage of the Rockefeller drug law. Both of these events lended themselves to mass incarceration as we came to know it. But it was in the 1980s with the war on crack particularly, where we see a mass expansion of the carceral state. The 1986 drug law, which was sort of the first tough on crime drug law in the crack era, declared that 1 gram of crack was equal to 100 grams of cocaine in terms of prosecutorial levels, in terms of how long you would go to prison. So 1 gram equals 100 grams. And again, penalizing Black and brown folks who are largely selling crack versus either wealthier Latino immigrants or white communities that are selling cocaine. The 1988 drug law criminalized abusers of crack as opposed to just dealers. So it's not just the dealers that are going to get tied up in the criminal justice system that are going to get to be a part of this mass incarceration that is taking off in the 1980s, but also those using it, those who are addicted to the drug. We're sending them to prison. We're not sending them to centers where they can get better. When George H.W. Bush was first inaugurated into office, his first major press conference was this whole big stunt where he had somebody buy crack across the street from the White House so that he could hold it up on national television and say, I bought this across the street from the White House. What he was trying to accomplish with this press conference was to show the whole country, this is a huge problem. This is something we have to deal with. We have to throw a bunch of people in prisons, mostly Black and brown people, as we'll talk about in a second, so that we get this drug out of the system of the United States. Mass incarceration, unsurprisingly, continued to rise during his administration. But it wasn't just Republicans who were tough on crime. It was also Democrats. In 1994, under President Clinton, the crime bill made mass incarceration rates even higher, penalizing drug abusers and drug dealers. And it also militarized the police in a way that would have ramifications to the present day, giving them weapons that are used for warfare as opposed to patrolling cities and towns across America. Many African Americans in inner cities wanted the violence to stop, wanted the drug use to stop. And supported some of these early drug laws that would be tough on crime. They thought perhaps this would protect their neighborhoods. Activists in Black communities, as well as their political allies, they started to get frustrated when they saw it was almost all Black and brown folks who were going to prison, despite this being a multiracial problem. One of the primary organizers in New York State who helped raise the awareness that mass incarceration was disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities, particularly in New York City, was a man named Eddie Ellis. He was targeted by the FBI for being a Black Panther, and he was accused of a murder he did not commit. He spent over 20 years in prison. He was involved in the Attica prison uprisings in 1971 before founding the Green Haven think tank, which conducted a few different studies, including the 7 Neighborhoods study. As prisoners themselves, they were able to talk to their fellow prisoners and map the racist criminal justice system. Published in the late 1970s, it showed that 85% of New York State's prison population was Black or Latino, and 75% of New York State, the whole state, came from 7 neighborhoods in New York City. 75% of the New York State prison population came from 7 neighborhoods in New York City. Think about that for a second. These neighborhoods: Harlem, the Lower East Side, South and Central Bronx, Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, and Jamaica, Queens, South Jamaica, Queens, to be precise. Sent such a large number of people to prison, not because these neighborhoods were innately criminal in a way that other neighborhoods weren't, but the laws in the country, particularly starting in the 1970s with the war on drugs and accelerating in the 1980s and 1990s, were designed to target Black and brown communities and poor communities. And this led to the mass incarceration crisis that still haunts the United States today. The work of Ellis and his colleagues, who were incarcerated at the time of their study, was picked up by other researchers who took a look at the unjust sentencing system in the United States. A study from 2003 showed that while over 80% of those sentenced for crack offenses to prison are Black, white and Hispanics accounted for about 66% of crack users. So the vast majority of those going to prison for crack-related offenses are Black. The vast majority of users are not. The Moorish Justice Project in the Bronx has traced sort of this phenomena of over-policing Black and brown folks and the destruction that it's caused their communities. So raising awareness, this matters, right? This allows people to say, you can't deny that this is a problem. This is the material, right? This is why the work of these organizers is so important. And given what's going on today, it gives data to organizers and activists who are seeking to make policy changes, who are seeking to make structural changes to the way that New York City's law enforcement operates. Beyond examining sort of the racist nature of drug laws and the war on drugs generally, and the racist ramifications of imprisoning Black and brown communities at a much higher rate than white communities, people began to ask questions about how these drugs arrived in the United States in the first place. We're not going to go too deep into the Contra scandal, but in the 1980s, the United States was supporting anti-communist guerrillas in Nicaragua. And there was a communist government that had been elected in Nicaragua in 1985. And the US federal government, Congress, passed a law saying, we cannot give money in opposition to this democratically elected communist government. Ronald Reagan was a big-time anti-communist, and he kind of ignored Congress. Many of his officials would go to prison because they ignored Congress, and they looked for ways to get money and guns to the Contras who were waging war against this democratically elected government in Nicaragua. And one of the ways they did this was by selling weapons to Iran, using that money to get weapons for the Contras in Nicaragua. But another way that they got money and weapons to these guerrilla fighters was by then allowing the planes that had delivered these weapons to the Contras, loading them up with drugs from Colombia and flying those drugs to the United States and letting the Contras gain the profits. And so in this way, the CIA either was actively involved in the drug trade, getting these drugs to the United States so that anti-communists could potentially be victorious in Nicaragua, even though they weren't, or they turned a blind eye and knew this was happening. Either way, they knew this was happening. And this infuriated African Americans. It was a decision by the Reagan administration saying, we would rather fight communism in Central America, even if that means allowing drugs in our inner cities and throughout our country, then stop the influx of drugs into the country. This was a decision made by a US presidential administration and his CIA. So this crack epidemic, which the US government did have some role in creating not just the economic circumstances for it to take hold of communities, but also the actual transporting of the drug to the United States, it leaves communities devastated because a lot of the communities are in prison for very long periods of time. Families are torn apart, both because of addiction and because folks are locked up or dead because of the drug wars. Further, the militarization of the police force, the giving them weapons of military grade so that they can patrol communities would lead to pretty devastating consequences. This over-policing of Black and brown communities, which has been going on as long as there have been police, it was made pretty publicly famous with the case of the Central Park Five. Puerto Rican and Black kids from Harlem and East Harlem decided they were going to go to Central Park. Police received reports that these teens were acting in a threatening manner, committing criminal acts. Different groups scattered throughout the park, and police just started arresting them at random. At 1:30 in the morning, a jogger was discovered, and she had been brutally raped and beaten and was near death. The kids who had just been sort of detained by the police, they decided to put a hold on those guys and keep them in custody. The kids that were in custody, they were between the ages of 14 and 16. So I want you to put yourself in that mindset. Late middle school, early high school kids, very young. They spent between 14 and 30 hours being interrogated by police officers. So think about sort of the mental strain of being interrogated between 14 and 30 hours. And you can imagine yourself in police custody being intimidated and just wanting to go home. And they're saying, you did this. We know you did this. We know you raped this woman. We know you tried to kill this woman. Just tell us the truth and we'll let you go home. And so they coached the kids into a confession. So after forcing these kids to confess on video, the woman woke up. She did not remember anything about the attack. So her testimony would not be useful in terms of prosecuting these kids. It was just these video confessions that were used to end up prosecuting these kids. And these Black and brown kids were described in the press and by politicians as animals and psychopaths. The cops lied about their role in sort of coercing these testimonies. And this became a huge national story. Donald Trump took out a full-page ad asking New York State to bring back the death penalty to give to these kids, again, between the ages of 14 and 16. Because there was no physical evidence, there was only the evidence of their confession, which again was forced out of them by cops and renounced shortly thereafter. From an outsider's view, it would seem that it would be really difficult to prosecute and convict these teens of this rape and attempted murder that there is no evidence to show that they did. However, the tension surrounding the case led to convictions. Because they were consistently maintaining their innocence, they said, we did not do this. These confessions were forced out of us by police officers. They were not offered parole because they had not shown remorse. And so they stayed in prison for a very long time, even when there was a lot of doubt about whether they had actually committed the crime. At the time, with 6 murders a day, it was this story that caught fire. And we got to ask ourselves why. And it fits into this long history of white women being used as the justification for punishing, often violently, Black and brown men. In the U.S. South, this took the form of lynchings or false imprisonment, as was the case with the Scottsboro case. In the U.S. North, sometimes there was murders and violence, as we'll see in a second, but the criminalization of these communities also was justified by the idea of needing to protect white women, in this case particularly. This story took a dramatic turn when in 2002, an incarcerated man named Mateus Reyes, he starts feeling bad about what he had done and the fact that these other guys were taking the heat for it. And so he comes out and he admits to the crime. He starts releasing details that nobody else would have known. His DNA was on the scene. And actually he was the East Side rapist who made headlines in his own right. He ended up being picked up for another crime later on, but he would continue committing rapes and murders until 1991. And again, Central Park 5 case took place in 1989. So with this new evidence in 2002, the convictions were overturned and the convictions were vacated. But again, these lives had been sort of ripped apart. Even those who were released before 2002, they were registered as sex offenders. They had trouble finding work. Police did an internal investigation and decided that they themselves had done nothing wrong. The detectives in the case blasted the decision to overturn the convictions. There was no admitting of guilt for what they had done to these young boys who had spent more than a third of their life in prison at that point. The prosecutor stood by the conviction, despite the fact that, the person who had done it confessed. There was no DNA evidence that linked the boys. They maintained their innocence the whole time. This other guy had all the details and all the DNA evidence. All these people, all these structures still committed to the guilt and this narrative that these boys had in fact committed the rape and attempted murder. In 2016, while he was running for president, Donald Trump still said he thought they were guilty. They would end up suing the city while the case was held up for years until the election of Mayor Bill de Blasio. Finally, the city settled with the Central Park Five, who were now men, for $41 million. Based on what they're seeing on the news or hearing from their politicians or know about Black communities, which really are devastated, no fault of their own. I mean, fault of landlords like Donald Trump and city policy. White New Yorkers are observing and saying Black communities are a mess. The drug problems are out of control. And these neighborhoods are filled with violent criminals because in terms of police reports, in terms of jail populations, in terms of media coverage, that is what it looked like. And so these stereotypes are feeding sort of a racial hatred, which would become both violent and deadly. In 1982, Willie Turks was one of 3 Black men that left a train yard in Sheepshead Bay. He stopped for bagels, where 2 white guys confronted him. They were shouting racial slurs at him, saying they didn't belong in the neighborhood. A gang of about 12 white 20-somethings ran over from a nearby schoolyard and chased and beat Turks and his friends, fracturing his skull. He would eventually die of his wounds. Turks's murder would be just one of a series of murders of Black New Yorkers by whites, which were fueled by racial hate, reminiscent of lynchings in the U.S. South. In 1986, just a few years later, Michael Griffith was one of 4 Black men whose car broke down. He and his friends walked to Howard Beach, but they ran into a group of white teens on the way who started jawing at them in a predominantly white neighborhood. They stopped at a pizza place on the way home, ran into the same group of white kids. 2 of the Black kids were badly beaten while getting hurled with racial slurs. Michael Griffith would be chased down by a car, and the driver of that car was the son of a police officer. Attempting to flee, he ran onto a highway where he was hit and killed. Now, the Queens DA was pretty sympathetic with the white defendants. This was seen as a huge issue. There was massive uproar in the Black community, and the governor had to appoint a special prosecutor just to make sure that the death of Michael Griffith was taken seriously. Yusuf Hawkins, 3 years later, of East New York. He was 16 years old. He went to Bentonhurst, which was predominantly at that time an Italian-American working-class neighborhood. Hawkins and his friends were looking to see about a car they wanted to buy. Some of the neighborhood residents heard a rumor that a Black guy and a white girl were dating, and so they waited for him to show up. The crowd descended on Hawkins and his friends with bats and a gun, and Hawkins ended up getting shot twice in the chest. These events led to a day of outrage and mourning. 7,500 demonstrators gathered on the Brooklyn Bridge. That march ended with violence as police clashed with protesters. So the city's Black residents are watching all of these acts of hate being taken on by civilians, white civilians, and very little sympathy being shown by the NYPD, which is not their allies in this cause. Instead, oftentimes it is covering for, as was the case with Michael Griffith, the white violators of Black civil rights. But it wasn't just civilians, obviously. Police brutality was rampant during this period, particularly during the mayoralship Giuliani. Again, he has sort of reinvented himself under the Trump administration. But in the 90s and early 2000s, he was mayor of New York. In 1996, a Haitian immigrant named Abner Louima was arrested, accused of fighting outside of a nightclub in Flatbush, Brooklyn. 4 police officers beat him and then tortured him in the bathroom of the 70th precinct. Cops initially tried to cover up the events but failed. Eventually, the cops involved were convicted. This event caused massive outrage, especially with the disgusting forms of torture they used against this young immigrant. And the outrage in this case and in all the cases generally is so important, right? Because otherwise there's just no accountability. The structures that govern U.S. society, law enforcement itself, it's not going to turn on itself. It needs to be pressured from below. And that's what happened in the case of Abner Louima, whose lead violator is still sitting in a prison cell all these years later. Yet obviously there's still a lot more work to do, because despite the mass outrage, despite the protests, this did not end the cycle of violence perpetuated against Black and brown communities in the city. On February 4th, 1999, Amadou Diallo, who was a 23-year-old immigrant from Guyana, he was killed by 4 plainclothes police officers in the doorway of his Bronx apartment building. They had demanded to see his wallet. As he went to reach for his wallet, they shot him with 41 bullets. 19 of them hit him. They said they mistook his wallet for a gun. The brutal death of Diallo led to massive demonstrations, and so much so that the city ruled that it couldn't give a fair trial to Diallo. And so they moved the location of the trial for the white police officers to Albany, New York, where they were all found not guilty by a mostly white jury. But activists and artists, they weren't going to let Diallo be forgotten. And so here we see him presented in a mural that marks his last words to his mother, "Mom, I'm going to college." He was remembered and continues to be remembered in the music of Erykah Badu, Lauryn Hill, Public Enemy, Wyclef Jean, The Strokes, Bruce Springsteen, 88 Keys. All of them produced songs detailing Diallo's life and death, making sure that he would never be forgotten, and the lessons that they wanted America to take and New York City to take from his death would live on. In response to the consistent drumbeat of murders and beatings by police officers against Black communities, activists hoped to stop others from suffering the same sort of fate as Willie Turks, Michael Griffith, Yusuf Hawkins, Abner Louima, and Amadou Diallo. The Black Panthers initially began, and this was spread by other Americans and has grown in popularity, programs that are under the umbrella of cop watching, where they will film encounters with police and arrests whenever possible, to make sure that if the police violate civil rights, they are held accountable. Perhaps the most famous case of cop watching in New York City took place in 2014 when police officers suffocated Eric Garner to death. Eric Garner was breaking up a fight in Staten Island when cops were called, and they hassled Garner, found that he was selling loose cigarettes, individual cigarettes, which was against the law, and they threw him down and strangled him to death. And he repeatedly said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." But the cops were never indicted. His murder went completely unpunished. And in fact, the person who was filming this event, he ended up being targeted by police. The person who decided not to indict the cops ended up running for Congress and was elected. Obviously, this sparked a ton of outrage after Eric Garner was killed, and the fact that the cops weren't charged, the fact that the person who decided not to charge them becomes an elected official. Without organizing against these killings and the torture of Abner Louima, the movement for Black lives as it exists today would not have been possible. But it was also catalyzed by racist policing and racist city policies that we'll discuss next, before diving into what's taken hold of the city since the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Now, this violence against Black and brown folks isn't happening because of a few bad apples. Instead, it's because white society in general had been trained by the media and politicians to assume the criminality of Black and brown people. In the 1990s and 2000s, unconstitutional policies like stop and frisk, which surveilled Black and brown communities and would literally stop and frisk without any cause. It was later deemed unconstitutional, but overwhelmingly, it was Black and brown folks who were targeted by this program. I remember I was a young teacher in New York City, and I would take the same train line as one of my students. He told me he was stopped almost monthly. I, as a white guy, was never stopped. And so whom was targeted in this stop and frisk program became fairly evident very quickly. Voices from the Heart of Gotham, the oral history project at Gutman Community College, repeatedly shows that experiences with law enforcement are defined by race. Here, Clarina Hewitt tells her story.
Racism, I never met really with a lot of it, but what I was always scared of for the boys was the cops on the streets. Many times they would be coming home and they would be, they never got arrested, but they would be slammed against walls, they would be rubbed down. But again, we were thankful that nothing more serious happened.
Well, from her tale, it seems like the cops never found anything on the children of Clarina. The same cannot be said for other Black New Yorkers, even though an extremely small percentage of stop and frisks resulted in the discovery of illicit materials. If Black folks and white folks commit small crimes like having a little marijuana on them or whatever, and one group is being stopped and searched and the other group isn't, the group that's being stopped and searched is going to go to prison at a much higher rate than the other. After that program was deemed illegal, another program called Broken Windows took its place, where it was a policy of punishing communities for small crimes, punishing individuals for small crimes. So the idea was with the hope of preventing big crimes. However, this just sort of accelerated mass incarceration. Just as it was profitable in the 1970s to undermine Black and brown communities, today, by over-policing these communities and by divesting in these communities, taking money out of social programs for these communities, policymakers are once again dislocating Black and brown New Yorkers from their homes. City policies have had some role in accelerating the process of gentrification. Segregation in New York City has increased for Black folks in the 21st century, with neighborhoods considered integrated with Blacks falling from 22.4% to 14.9% between 1970 and 2010. Gentrification has led to huge rent increases. For instance, in Bed-Stuy between 2000 and 2010, rent increased 22%. And this phenomena is only increasing with gig apps like Airbnb, where people will own a property and never live in it and can make money without ever occupying it, and just nobody ever occupies it, and they just sell it to short-term renters. And so this increases the value of everybody's property, which means that landlords could charge more for rent for low-income communities. Unable to afford rent, we see a trend towards reverse migration back to the South for Black and brown communities. So this persistent income inequality and the resulting school inequity and neighborhood inequity has led to a lot of outrage and is the underpinning of some of the anger that's going on. With political structures consistently burdening Black and brown communities in the city, African-American leaders took it upon themselves to get elected to office so that they could change the rules that govern their communities. In 1990, David Dinkins became the first African-American mayor, defeating Republican nominee Rudolph Giuliani. Giuliani would go on to win in a later election. The first African-American Democrat to run for president was also from New York City. In 1972, Shirley Chisholm, who was a representative from the 12th Congressional District in Brooklyn, launched her campaign to become the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. David Patterson became the first lieutenant governor who was African-American in 2007 and ended up becoming governor when Eliot Spitzer, who was the governor at the time, resigned in 2008. However, as for those who were unaware, learned over the summer of 2020. Political power has not equated equity under the law for Black New Yorkers. For many, having watched the video of the murder of George Floyd and knowing these stories within their own community, the protests that exploded in 2020 were most tangibly tied to the relationship between cops and Black communities. Listen here from testimonies from the archive, voices from the heart of Gotham, the undergraduate scholars oral history collection at Gutman Community College, where New Yorkers explained why they protested in the wake of George Floyd's murder.
I don't feel that I'm treated equally. I feel like everyone, or other, like as a minority, I feel like it's almost as if we just, like I said, took it for granted. We're unable to receive and reap the same benefits that other races are. Right. It's a little unfair.
Police violations of rights of protesters during the protests is still coming to the light. However, it's already clear that, for instance, a goon squad manual, which taught officers to violate the rights of protesters, as reported by The Intercept, was passed around the NYPD in the wake of the George Floyd murder. More of this will come to light as the years go on. We're sometimes too deep in the thick of it to really see the bigger picture and what the future holds for race relations and the Black community in New York City, and how they will be treated by the structures of power that have long undermined efforts to achieve equality and liberation for Black New Yorkers.